Hello and welcome. I'm Dr. Joanne Lisosky, author and journalism educator, and we're here to discuss issues of importance to the Caucasus. Joining us today is Professor Rob Sobhani, Iranian-American author and expert on energy, domestic policies, and international relations. He's also chairman and CEO of the Caspian Group and formerly, and maybe soon to come again, a professor at Georgetown University. Welcome, Professor Sobhani.
Thank you very much for having me, Joanne. I appreciate it. And hello to your viewers.
Thank you. The Iranian foreign minister visited 5 nations last week: Azerbaijan, Armenia, Georgia, Turkey, and Russia. Now, these are all members of the 3+3 cooperative group. What was the ultimate goal of this visit?
I think, Joanne, if there was one lesson that we learned from the recent conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan, it was the diminished role of Iran and Iranian diplomacy. We really did see Russia stepping up to the plate from a diplomatic perspective, but most importantly, Turkey stepped up. And so I feel like Mr. Zarif's visit was really an attempt to try to elevate Iranian diplomacy in the region, something they were not able to do during the conflict, and something that I think they've had some challenges with, quite frankly.
So how do you think this 3+3 will play out?
I think that at the end of the day, Russia will play a more robust role in the manner in which Armenia and Azerbaijan work out their differences. It seems to be revolving around economic cooperation. After all, the territory of Nagorno-Karabakh and around it is similar to size to Rhode Island. So if you can imagine a area the size of Rhode Island now needs roads, bridges, power line, water maintenance, all that requires funding. And so I believe that Russia, along with the EU, at the helm of which right now probably the French are going to lead, are going to think about a package for the reconstruction and development of the Nagorno-Karabakh region. And again, I don't see a role for Iran in this endeavor. The Iranian role has been diminished because its fundamental foreign policy objectives are not in line necessarily with the interests of Azerbaijan. And not necessarily in line with the interests of Turkey or the EU. So moving forward, I really don't see much role for Iran.
So in the 45-day war, Azerbaijan liberated the southern region and the Hudafan Bridge. And now there seems, as you said, there seems to be some real challenges between Iran dealing with Azerbaijan. However, the foreign minister couldn't have been more gracious with Baku. What are the challenges to Tehran in changing from dealing with Armenia, and now in the same region they are dealing with Azerbaijan?
Well, Joanne, before the war, Iran described Armenia as a strategic ally, a strategic partner. It was a deep relationship between Yerevan and Tehran. And what triggered the backlash was images on social media of Iranian military transport delivering military hardware to Armenia. That triggered an enormous backlash within Iran. There were demonstrations in Tabriz. There were demonstrations in other parts of Azerbaijan, the Iranian side. And that immediately led to a recognition by the Iranian regime that if this continued, it could very well have put the regimes itself in danger of collapsing. Keep in mind, the 1979 revolution started in Tabriz with the demonstrations in Tabriz. And so the Iranian regime was extremely fearful that the crowds in Tabriz that were chanting anti-regime slogans because of the regime's support for Armenia would morph into a nationwide protest against the regime and its very existence.
So Tehran has some real challenges ahead in trying to appease its own people and their feeling. I mean, Tehran might have a different feeling than their own people, though, right?
I've always maintained, Joanne, that when we talk about Iran, it's extremely important to distinguish between the people of Iran and the regime of Iran. The Iranian regime is a cause. The Iranian regime is wedded to the ideology of anti-Semitism, anti-Americanism, adventurism, whereas the Iranian people want nothing more than just a simple life, no different from what we experience here in the US or their neighbors experience in the region. And from day one, this regime has had to deal with opposition from the Iranian regime. It's an interesting statistic, maybe for your viewers to know, that there are over 25 satellite television stations that are beamed into Iran against the Iranian regime. And so this is a regime that from its very existence has had to struggle with legitimacy and with trying to persuade its people that it is legitimate. And the people have pushed back, and we've seen those demonstrations 2 years ago. We saw those demonstrations after the elections of Mr. Mahmoud Ahmadinejad. We saw it in 1999. And so there is a definite divergence between what the people of Iran want and what the Iranian regime seeks.
Is it possible that the Iranian regime then is sort of turning its attention to Azerbaijan and maybe, I mean, as I said, they were very gracious in Baku. Are they turning, would they rather be partnered? Do they mind being partnered with Azerbaijan, or would they still rather be partnered with Armenia?
I think a lot of what Iran does also depends on how they view their relation with Russia. Mm-hmm. There is an extremely strong relationship between the Iranian regime and the Russian government. There are elements within the Supreme Leader's office that are very closely aligned with Russia, with Moscow. And so I think the Iranian regime, when it looks at the Caucasus, also takes its cue from what the Russians may or may not want the Iranian regime to do. But that said, there is no doubt that the experience of massive demonstrations against the regime by the citizens of Tabriz was a wake-up call for the regime that they need to rethink their relation with Azerbaijan. Now, again, that said, the government of Azerbaijan and the people of Azerbaijan have obviously a fundamental difference with the Iranian regime. Mm-hmm. The government of Azerbaijan is secular. You never see the first lady, quote unquote, of the Iranian regime, but you see the first lady of Azerbaijan all the time. And
she's the vice president.
Exactly. So obviously women's rights, women's freedom, gender equality matter to Azerbaijan. Religious tolerance is part of the DNA of Azerbaijan. It's woven within the fabric of Azerbaijan. Religious freedom is suppressed in Iran. The Baha'i community are harassed, murdered, persecuted. The Jewish community are harassed and persecuted. Christians are harassed and persecuted in Iran. So there is a fundamental difference within the fabric of both countries as well, or at least the regime of Iran, not necessarily the people of Iran.
Right. Thank you, Professor. That really gives some insights into this relationship. Now, let's talk a little bit about what part the U.S. administration might play in this 3x3. Is it possible, do you think, that the Biden administration may ease off and maybe again be part of the Iranian nuclear deal?
There seems to be no doubt that from top down, President Biden, Mr. Blinken, Jake Sullivan, and then, of course, Wendy Sherman, the deputy to Mr. Blinken, Robert Malley, now the Iran coordinator, they all were part of the team that did negotiate the Iran nuclear deal. And there is obviously an interest to rejoin that deal. However, I think the world has changed since the Iran nuclear deal part one. Today, Israel is officially recognized by the United Arab Emirates. Israel is officially recognized by Bahrain. Israel has warm relations, not official, but with Saudi Arabia. And I think those three American allies, and if you add Israel, 4 American allies, are going to want to have something to say about a hasty return to the Iran nuclear deal. Personally, from my perspective, I would hope that President Biden, who seems to understand justice and the importance of social justice, also takes into account the rights of the Iranian people. The fact that Iranian women are persecuted because they don't want to wear the hijab. The fact that they murder journalists. The fact that they murder a world-renowned wrestler. I would hope that President Biden and his team, who put a premium on the lives of those who are less fortunate in America, also put the same value on the life of Iranians. If Black lives matter in America, which is important, Iranian lives matter as well.
Very good point. Thank you, Professor. Now, you say Russia is kind of a very big player and even the 3+3, but they may be at this point very distracted by their own problems internally. Yesterday, Alexei Navalny was sentenced to 3.5 years in prison, and we are watching thousands upon thousands of people being beaten in the street and jailed for supporting him. What do you think? You have some insights. What do you think the subsequent reaction might be to his jailing and the protesters being beaten and jailed? What kind of sanctions might be possible?
I was in Moscow when the Soviet Union collapsed, and I saw it in front of my own eyes.
Wow.
The collapse of this empire that we thought was invincible. And within 3 days, it literally crumbled in front of our eyes. I'm not suggesting that's going to be the case with President Putin, but what I'm suggesting is that political movements have a way of morphing into something far bigger and creating a situation where uncertainties become certainties. And so I do think that if we look at history and we look at collapse of regimes or empires, they usually happen from within and also from without. So in the case of the Soviet Union, it started collapsing from the periphery, but there is also something fundamentally wrong inside. And I think the people of Russia are beginning to understand that their lives can be better. 30% or 32% of Russians don't have access to a pharmacy in a country that should be one of the richest in the world. And so, and a country, by the way, that has enormous talent. The Russians are some of the smartest people, and yet they think that their creativity has yet to blossom. I mean, after all, this is a country that gave the world Tchaikovsky, gave the world Tolstoy, gave the world Pushkin. And I think the Russian people are finally waking up to the fact that they want to put their best foot forward, put the best foot forward of Russian culture, Russian music, Russian art, and move away from this authoritarian narrative that has been under the control of Mr. Putin.
Well, it'll definitely be something that we need to watch, especially in the Caucasus, just as far as they are so important in the post-war situations that are happening. And I want to ask you a little bit about the Russian troops in Azerbaijan. How long do you think this might remain the status quo in the Karabakh region?
I think to the extent that Azerbaijan welcomes, for now, those Russian troops, because they give the ability for the international community to work towards putting together that economic package for reconstruction and development that I referred to earlier. I think Azerbaijan will tolerate Russian troops on its territory. Also, I think that, you know, when one looks at Armenia and Armenian history and what happened to the Armenians, it gives comfort to them that there are Russian troops. But I think ultimately the Azerbaijani side would want to see the departure of Russian troops and maybe replacement with UN peacekeepers. I don't see any reason why Azerbaijan would object to UN peacekeepers, so long as it was done in a stable transformation from Russian troops to UN peacekeepers. Again, the Azerbaijani goal is to ensure that there is the ability for the international community to put together those economic packages for the reconstruction and development of Karabakh. That's the #1 priority of the Azerbaijani government right now.
So raising funds in some way. So
yeah, it's no different, Joanne, from what we did after the Second World War with the Marshall Plan. Mm-hmm. You know, if there were to be an equivalent, I'd say it's the Marshall Plan for the Nagorno-Karabakh region, essentially. And so that's where the priority is right now.
So, I mean, given the war and COVID, the economic situations and the destruction that occurred during the war, besides looking at, you've already mentioned looking at the EU and maybe some other places for funding, any other suggestions, ideas? I mean, what can we do to grow the infrastructure and the economy after COVID and the war?
I think, Joanne, that's a fantastic question. And two things come to my mind, and these are two things that have become a paradigm shift as a result of COVID. One is e-commerce. E-commerce is here to stay. And if you look at the interrelation between Alibaba and the lowering of poverty rates in China, they correlate. Mm-hmm. When Alibaba took off and those supply chains that were connected to small businesses in China were able to benefit from Alibaba, poverty rates collapsed or went down. I think one of the top priorities of Azerbaijan should be e-commerce, should be to start setting up those logistic network supply chains that connect small businesses, medium businesses, and then create that portal so that the world can come shop from Azerbaijani small businesses, and kind of like the Amazon for Azerbaijan. I think that has, first, it's cultural diplomacy. It shows the world what Azerbaijan is, shows the soul of Azerbaijan. It'll introduce the world to beautiful artists like Fidan, whose paintings are the melange of French Impressionism and Azerbaijani culture. So I think that's important. But then, of course, Azerbaijan being an energy producer, I think it's really important for Azerbaijan to start thinking about the post-oil era and maybe start thinking about investing some of the sovereign wealth fund that they have in renewable energy, maybe solar energy would be one way to look at, and maybe become a hub for the manufacture of solar panels throughout the world. So those are just two things that I can think of that maybe the government of Azerbaijan and the private sector should start thinking about. Because tourism, I think we're maybe 2-3 years away for the comfort level to grow for tourists to go back and visit Azerbaijan. And oil, unfortunately, is going to probably be in the price range of $40-50. And more importantly, 69% of every barrel of oil that comes out of the ground goes towards the transportation sector. Mm-hmm. And we're seeing a revolution in the transportation sector towards electric vehicles. And so that's going to mean the diminishing of the importance of oil as we move forward. The third thing that maybe Azerbaijan should be doing, which I think we've already seen glimpses of, is to build a trans-Caspian from Turkmenistan across the Caspian to Azerbaijan and to Europe. And I think the recent announcement between Turkmenistan and Azerbaijan on the Dostluk field is maybe indication that they're thinking along those lines.
So we missed a little bit of what you said. You sort of froze up a little. Did you say the Trans-Caspian Rail?
Trans-Caspian Pipeline.
Pipeline, okay.
To deliver, as you know, Europe has always wanted to diversify its supplies away from Russia. And so Turkmenistan has the world's 4th largest reserves of gas. And so connecting Turkmenistan and Central Asia to Europe through this Trans-Caspian pipeline would make Azerbaijan a global hub and transit point for gas going into Europe.
So I appreciate your vast knowledge of all the oil and gas and things like that. That's really giving us some real insights. And because the corridors and bridges are now open too, we might see some Amazon trucks traveling, and that's an excellent idea to look into e-commerce. And I want to thank you, Professor, for being with us. I hope you don't mind if we call you back again sometime. This has been a great insight. Thank you, Professor Rob Sobhani, and we appreciate it, and please stay healthy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joanne. It's been a pleasure to be on your program, and I am absolutely delighted and look forward to our next conversation.
Terrific. Thank you.
Thank you.